So let's start out with maintenance. When and why would you do maintenance? One of the things that you've got to ask yourself about your maintenance plan would be, do I plan on keeping my car? Is it going to be a 2-year event? I'm going to get rid of it in 2 years. I'm leasing the car, not too concerned about it. If you're in a position of keeping the car a couple years, chances are you might change the oil a couple times, and that's about all you care about, especially in a lease. If you end up buying the car and plan on keeping it a couple of years, and you've purchased the car, when I go to look at a car, one of the first things I look for a customer or for myself, what kind of maintenance has been done to that vehicle? How often has it been maintained? What's been taken care of? Because A, we don't want to do maintenance on a car. We don't want our car sitting anywhere but in our garage, if at all possible, right? At every minute, be able to jump in it and go. I mean, that's pretty much what's ingrained in us now. There's no maintenance. Minimal or none. Now, we'll go for number one, engine oil, because that's the thing, we all have to do it. Like I said, lease or not. So, the first thing about engine oils is this. Every year that a new engine comes out, there's a lot of validation testing done to make sure that the oil you're using will be compatible and make that engine live a long, long time. So, if General Motors says in the new C7 engine they want Dexos oil, there's a reason why they did that. Believe it or not, it's not just to sell oil. Even though that makes a lot of sense, it does. They make a new formulation. So we've got a huge span. We're going from 1950s right up to present day. Should you put the same engine oil that you have in a 1955 Corvette in a 2005? No. Does anybody know why we should put different oil in that early engine? Anybody got an idea? Yes, sir. There you go. That's it. Zinc. What happened is the manufacturers decided through the federal government that we need to make these catalytic converters last longer. So if we eliminate zinc from the oil, it will make a catalytic converter last quite a bit longer. Now, here's where the problem is. An early engine with flat tappet camshaft doesn't like that. It wears out the cam and lifters much quicker. So, you have to run a zinc additive or a zinc-rich oil in that early engine. Now, here's the rub. If you go to any auto parts store and you tell them, I want oil for my 1965 Corvette, what they're going to do is they're going to go on their screen and they'll say, oh, you can use this, anything. Basically, any oil. So it's your due diligence to go and make darn sure you're putting the right oil in your engine. Now, there are zinc additives, and a lot of people do put zinc additives in with their favorite engine oil. I don't think that's a problem, but you definitely have to have the zinc additive. Typically, you want 10 to 15%. You don't want 100%. You got to have your lubricants. I am not a chemical engineer. I'm not going to tell you that I am. Again, this is from just plain old out there in the field and looking at things, watching them, and seeing how things last. We personally have a couple of vehicles with 300,000 miles on them, and basically it's been about using the correct oil. So, zinc in the early ones. Anything with a flat cam. I'm going to go ahead and send around a lifter. This is a typical lifter you'd find in an engine up until 1986. Everything built after 1986 is just about all going to be a roller camshaft. Trucks, some of them are still flat tappet. But I'm going to send this lifter around and you can see what happens to a lifter. This should be a flat surface and now it's concave. And that's from, unfortunately, the wrong oil. So I'll go ahead and hand it out. So if you decide that you're going to use an oil that is a 100% zinc rich oil, Brad Penn, they make a great oil that is, it is actually a zinc rich oil that's correct for an early engine. Now that oil comes in a lot of different weights, and we're going to go into that here in just a bit. But that particular oil, I like it because it's already blended, it has the correct amount of zinc, it comes out of a bottle, you don't have to go there and make a witch's brew every time you go to do an oil change. You definitely got what you need in there. Now, as the engines progressed and they went to a roller cam, it's not infallible. They still had their issues. There are things that happen to roller cam engines with the oil. Now we're going to go ahead and send around another lifter. This particular lifter is out of a roller cam engine, an LS1 engine that had the correct oil in it. Wasn't changed. It was changed every time the engine oil change reminder came up. So this is a common issue with these engines. Around 200,000, you might get lucky and go 200. 180, 200,000, they will hurt a lifter. So here's the thing about engine oil. Engine oil, when you put it in the engine, you put a synthetic engine oil in, right off the bat, pretty good stuff. But as it runs and you have your engine running and you run it for any length of time, what do you think ends up in the oil? Do you have any idea what happens from blow-by and the combustion process? What goes on? We get fuel in the oil. And there's no way to eliminate that because rings do leak. And when they leak, it allows combustion gases and fuels to get into the oil. Once it gets into the oil, it starts to lose viscosity. Even the synthetic will lose the viscosity. So that's why you change engine oil. That's exactly the reason why. There's contaminants certainly from sulfur and other items that occur from normal combustion process. But here's the thing. If you don't change your oil on a regular basis, or you probably push it to the very limit, that oil's in pretty bad shape by the time you change it. So it's very important to use the correct oil. And when it comes to the later engine, LS1 and stuff, GM's got some recommendations. Mobil 1 synthetic, 10W30, that's my favorite oil for those. 5W30, 10W30, depending on your climate. But that's the best oil for that engine. That's what we found over long-term use. 7,500 miles, I'd go 7,500 without changing the oil, but it's not going to be a car I'm sitting around and driving through the city all day long, because that's the worst time. Your engine is not efficient until it goes into closed-loop operation, which is about 5 minutes. By 5 minutes, everything's really heated up. It's really controlling the fuel well. And that's the best possible time. On the highway, it's at its most efficient time. It's going to use and get the least amount of oil, or say fuel, into the oils. So that's the best time to do it. Or that's the best it can be. So here's another very interesting fact. When the C5 engine, LS1, came out, for years, we were building engines with a lot of clearance. We were building with 2 to 3, sometimes even as much as 4 thousandths clearance crankshaft bearing to crankshaft. And what we have is a hydrodynamic wedge that occurs, keeping the oil away from the bearings. An engine bearing, these crankshaft bearings, rod bearings, main bearings, they should never ever touch the crankshaft. Seems impossible, but it does run that way. If your oiling system is correct, it keeps the crankshaft floating and the rods floating, never touching the crankshaft. So General Motors, everybody found this. They said, you know what? We can eliminate some emissions. We can get a little bit more power if we close up those clearances, and instead of going 2 thousandths, we go down to less than 1 thousandths clearance. We're talking about a newspaper the thickness of a newspaper between the bearing and the crankshaft. So they've got this very light, thin bit of oil running through those bearings, and it keeps oil from spraying onto the cylinder walls, which in turn help them get better fuel mileage, less friction, less drag, and cleaner. So here's the problem. An old school guy's going to go, you know what? I'm going to put 20W50 in my engine. Hey, it's a Corvette, man. That's what we did with all of them. And that is absolutely the worst thing you can do. Because that 20W50 oil, when the engine's cold, it takes quite a while for it to actually get to the bearings, because it's so much thicker than that original oil that they designed, which was 5W30, even 0W30. We want the oil to be at those bearings ASAP, man. As soon as you fire that engine up, you want it there. So that's one of the big changes that occurred. So you've got to really watch it. If General Motors tells you they want a particular oil, they know it'll go out of their warranty period and beyond. If you decide to try some other oil, you could be taking a chance. And the scary part is today, what I'm finding, you can go on the internet, which, hey, we all love to Google it. You go on there, you look at it, and you find that there's this product, there's this oil that does this, and this does that. And the bottom line is, you got to trust them with your engine. So the best thing to do is put what is recommended by the manufacturer. If you're building a race engine, you build an LS1, LS3, LS6, LS7, and you open up the clearances, fine, put your race oil. But don't do that with your stock engine. You're going to be sorry you did that. I've got a bearing here that came out of a LS engine. Has a little bit of wear. You can look at this bearing and see as it goes around, there's actually a spot on it. The crankshaft's hit the bearing. Now, that means there's debris floating in your oil. So if you decide, if you think that an oil filter will stop everything, that doesn't happen that way. It stops a lot of contaminants, but it doesn't stop everything. There's no way it can. Well, I shouldn't say that. There are filters out there in Mid-America. They've got a great filter. It's a spin-on. You take it apart and clean it. Great for the environment. But you know, it's one of those situations that, you know, you're putting a lot of bucks in a filter. You'll never have to buy another one. You buy one time and do it. And there's a little bit invested. These, of course, you get one, spin it off, spin it on, there you go. Now, as long as the oil filter happens to be in a horizontal position, I always recommend filling the oil filter with oil before you put it back on the engine. If you go to a lot of quick lube places, I guarantee you that doesn't happen, just because it takes a little bit longer. I'm not telling you they're all like that, but you know, that's something you should say, hey, if you're going to do my oil change, would you please maybe fill that filter with oil before you start the engine? Because when you go to start it up, you got to fill the filter first, then it gets all through your engine, so it hurts it. We've got a filter here. This happens to be something we found in Mid-America catalog. I mean, a magnet. Sorry about that. Magnet. Now, a lot of people think that, you know, you don't need that stuff. It's, smoke and mirrors. But if you think about it, a magnet is a great piece to put on a filter. Because if you do have any metal, which you do, there is no way of getting away from some metal in the oil stream. There's just no way. It's going to happen. Just a fact of things rotating around and touching every once in a great while. But that filter, that magnet, will keep that stuff at least in the filter. It'll help keep a bunch of it in the filter and you get rid of it. Usually when you go somewhere though, you know, they put on here do not discard, because a lot of guys just dump it in there, then you don't have it. So you might want to mention that. But that's well worth a couple of bucks it costs to put on there and keep your engine in good shape. Okay, and then we also have this Mobil 1 extended filter. You know, they're a little bit more money. They're going to cost you a few bucks more. But if you plan on going a longer oil change interval, not a bad idea to have a little bit better filter on there. And it's all about flow. Filters, you know, there's a trade-off. If you cut down the flow, you're going to hurt your engine. So they have to have the filter media so that it will trap particles, yet it will also be able to let this oil flow at a reasonable rate to keep the engine in good shape. So Is this a good plan? Yes, it is. It really is. Now, let's talk about that just a minute. So this is a person that plans on, you buy that C4, you buy up to C7, and you say, you know what? This is maybe the only Corvette I ever want. Man, I'm in love with this thing. I want it forever. Well, if you're going to do that, you need to keep the fuel, all your levels right, all your fluids, all your oil. Put the good oil in it, change the oil at recommended intervals. Okay, very good point. So here's the thing. So everybody they want to change their oil. When do I do it? Early, before or after the season? The bottom line is, like I said, unless you've got a place that thing is going to be perfectly hermetically sealed and not get any type of cold and heat change, what's going to happen is you're going to have contaminants in the oil. There will be water. You will get water vapor in the engine. It'll happen. Condensate happens. It's just a matter of fact. You take a piece of metal, you put it in your garage, piece of aluminum, you set that in your garage and watch what happens overnight. Well, not overnight, but over the season. Next thing you know, you look at it and say, this thing's got rust on it. How'd that happen? It's perfectly dry and there wasn't anything there. It's from condensation. That cold picks up the cold, changes temperature, and it has condensation. And that's what's happening inside your engine. Even though you think, oh, it's got coated with oil. But if it sits there for 2 months, after a little while, that oil starts to go away enough, they'll find a spot here and there to create condensation. So it's a very good thing. So I say I change it right before I'm going to use it for the season. Run it a little bit, get it warmed up. I always like to warm it up, drain the oil then, put everything fresh in it. That's my recommendation. After many, many years, like I said, it's worked out very well for me. Everything's involved. I'm going to go right because we need to move on here to coolant. That's the number one thing that I see in every vehicle that comes in. I have guys tell me that the coolant has been well maintained. No issue. I change the coolant all the time. Well, here's the cold hard facts of coolant changing, of doing any type of service with the cooling system. You have to drain the engine block. Nobody wants to do it. It's a messy job, but it is the correct way to do it. They make a fantastic machine with all kind of things that spin around and impress you when they hook it up to the heater hoses, and it looks like the story is, oh, it's taken every bit of dirty coolant out and we just put in fresh coolant and your engine's good to go. There is no way that can physically happen. I have had numerous companies come to my shop and tell me that this is the machine I've been looking for my entire life. It will save me all that trouble of taking the block drains out. And not one time has it proven to be correct. Because you can't do it. Your engine is a V engine, as we know. At the bottom of the V, there are drain plugs. If you happen to have an early car, way back, 55 all the way right up to the LS engine, right up to 96. There are drains in the side of the block, and if you want to service the cooling system properly, you have to remove them and flush the coolant. I got a heck of a specimen here. Believe it or not, that's 2-year-old coolant sitting in a jug in the shop. It hasn't been, this was good old Prestone. Well, I better not say that. I don't know if it was Prestone, but it was a green antifreeze. Sitting in the shop. Now, the story is if you take any coolant and put it out in the sunlight, the UV will change it, eliminate its color. But this coolant, this was from a car that the owner told me that he changed the coolant every 2 years without fail. And if you look at it, you see on the bottom of that, there is a bunch of debris. You know what that is? Iron oxide. That's the engine block. That's it's a cathodic. It slowly goes away. It eats away at the block, no matter how good you take care of it. So if you don't take those plugs out, this stuff builds up. 90% of the overheating problems we find, it would be from coolant that's never been totally serviced. It's because somebody's come in, they have drained it at the radiator, they've taken 1.5 gallons out, and that's it. The system holds almost 4 gallons of coolant and water when they're typically totally drained. So as you can imagine, if you take 1.5 gallons out of a system with 4 gallons, you're not doing a heck of a lot. And if you want to make sure your car sticks around a while, that's what you need to do. Now the LS engines with the oat coolant, which is the orange coolant, we got a little different scenario. We have aluminum. And if anybody's observed the fact that those engines have a reservoir up on the fender and the coolant level is, and the radiators up front, they always keep coolant in there, but we don't have that extra jug that we had in the old days. The 84, well, back in 73 or so, we started putting these coolant recovery jugs on to keep coolant always in the radiator. Because if you introduce air with water, even if it has coolant, what happens? Rust occurs, corrosion occurs. But we don't have that issue with aluminum, so they went ahead and did it. But they also put the reservoir up high enough to make sure that the parts are always coated with coolant. So the worst thing you can do to a C4, C3 engine, C2 engine, C1 engine is to let it have an area that it has no coolant touching it, because it's a breeding ground for that right there. So that's what we're talking about. That's what's flowing through that system. And this is not a bad one. I mean, we've had them so bad that we've had to go through those and take the plugs out and we use a rusticide, which you'd clean the side of your house if you got sprinkler, you got some dirt, the sulfur. Works great, but it's a big, big deal because usually the water pump needs replacement, the heater hoses, but you can prevent it by changing the coolant. Now you go to the typical garage and you tell them you want to pull those plugs out of the block, they'll have a lot of excuses because it isn't a pretty job. It really isn't. But if you want to keep your engine in tip-top shape, 4 years maximum, that's what I say. I do it 2 years in my stuff because I'm always on the road. So I do it every 2 years, but I drain every bit of coolant. And we've gone 300,000 miles. I got 2 vehicles over 300,000 miles. Never had to do anything to them, serious, ever. And it's because of maintenance. Both of the plugs on the engine block are located basically where your exhaust pipes come down above the oil pan line. If you got spark plug shielding, yeah, they're two hex plugs, 9/16 hex, huh? 9/16 hex. Unless you've been to a machine shop and had an engine overhauled, and they put in there Allen bolts, Allen plugs with an Allen wrench, and in those guys, I just want to scream because you can't hardly ever get an Allen out because there's just not enough bite on it.
Some cases you pull that plug out, nothing comes out.
Exactly.
Because it's corroded in there, you got to take a screwdriver.
Exactly.
Out, loose for it to drain out.
Exactly.
I've seen that happen.
Exactly.
Not of mine, but I've seen it.
Oh yeah, it's a common problem. And then you got some issues. If you run into that, if you got to use a screwdriver and physically get that thing cleared out enough to get coolant to drain, you got a project on your hands now. Or, put the plugs back in and let your buddy have the car before something serious happens to it. But this is something that has to be done. Yes, sir. What I like to do, I like to take both the heater hoses off and run coolant through them. Yeah. Now, if we're going to pull a heater hose off a car, I always tell the customer you need a new heater hose. Because one of the things you don't do is yank on a heater hose on anything, because it will be time for a new heater hose, a new heater core. What I usually do, I take a razor knife, I slit it, peel it away, because it's just a fact of life. And here's something else too. I've also learned, like in a C4, if you don't want to put a heater core in a C4. So if anybody's got a C4, you are the ones that absolutely want to take care of that coolant more so than anybody. Because if you put a heater core in a C4 one time, you probably won't want the car anymore. I've got a couple of buddies that have that, and they're using that right now. And so far, the results are good. But the problem with coolant, it takes years to really know, as far as what it will do to keep the corrosion down. Because it's one thing to have, the cooling properties. And, the bottom line is, the more coolant you put in the engine, the less cooling it does. As crazy as that sounds. Coolant does not get rid, it's not very conductive. It doesn't do a really great job of convection and getting rid of heat. Because I tell anybody, if you're south of the Mason-Dixon line, I wouldn't run 50-50 coolant. I'd run 40-60. Because you can run more coolant, more water. Put 60% water in there.
Distilled water.
Distilled, yeah. Absolutely. And that is the other thing. We always use distilled water in the shop. It's cheap enough. It's there. Why not use it? Because God knows what's in the water system today. So that is the number one thing. And I see it so often. I see coolant-related issues all the time. If your engine runs hotter, you're killing it. You're killing it. That's the bottom line. And we're running them on the edge anyway. If you've got a late model car, the reason we run it so high and that temperature is so it gets hotter quicker, the cats light off quicker, and it has less emissions. That's all to make the federal government happy. And really, it's not a terrible thing. It really isn't. Because if you think an engine running at 200 degrees is a terrible thing, it's not. If old man like me, I want to see a 160, but that's not good. Water boils 212, right? So if you've got engine oil and you're running it at 100, you're running your coolant at 180 and your engine oil's never getting to that 212, it's not good for it. You're not getting rid of the contaminants that would normally occur in there. So it's actually better to do that. It's hard for me to convince a lot of guys, man. They say, oh, I'm running a 160 thermostat and I want that oil as cool as it can be. And that's great if you're racing the car, because chances are it will be above that. But if you got your everyday driver, you want that thing to be 200 degrees. And there's nothing scary about it if you maintain your cooling system. So that is the key to it. And when you maintain it, you take you drain your coolant, look at the hoses, feel the hoses, make sure they're not, if you squeeze a hose and it sounds crackly, you hear it crackle, again, it looks like that, it's got that junk in it, it's full of metal, and the hoses are coated. And then it's time to do the old trick with the rusticide, and you usually end up with a water pump. It's like a big deal. So the good thing is, if you take care of it, you don't have to worry about that. That's really the benefit of it. Okay, on to transmission fluid. Now this is another fluid, especially if you got a C5, 6, or 7. Basically you're not going to have somebody change the fluid or check the fluid level for you. The only way you do that is on the lift. So, as far as the oils are concerned, they don't last forever. They really and truly don't. I've got a Duramax diesel. We just changed the transmission fluid before we came up here. It's been about 3 years since I've done it. And $200 for the fluid, by the way. But, hey, you play big, you got to pay. But at any rate, here's the thing about these transmissions. They circulate, they've got clutch plates. They've got fibrous clutch plates. As these fibrous clutch plates engage and disengage, they're encased in fluid. They are liquid, a wet type plate. So if that plate is wet the entire time and it has particles that are graphite and fibrous, they start to come off of that plate. It's a fact of life. They don't come off, hopefully, if everything's right, very little each time you shift a gear. But as it does do that, as these things wear, you got plates that end up with this stuff in the bottom of your pan. And when a guy pulls a transmission, this automatic anyway, he pulls the automatic transmission pan off, he'll find there's a black, this black dust look in there. It's almost a film. It's not metal. It's not really metallic. If it's metallic, then you got another story altogether. But you'll see it's a black film that ends up in there. And it's actually, that's your clutch plates that are wearing. So yes, you do have a filter that will help take care of that problem. But the bottom line is that it starts to clog up the filter somewhat, lose some of the efficiency, and it hurts the performance of your transmission. So transmission change every 3 or 4 years. It really should be done. And I suggest a total flush. Now, a lot of guys will tell you that I don't want to do that total flush. I want to take the pan, do a 5-quart change, which I say, why? If today we've got a machine available like we got in the shop, you hook it up to the cooler lines, you pump out all the old fluid, you put fresh fluid in. Then darn good and well you got clean fluid. Should you change the filter? I'd say every other time I did the transmission fluid exchange. If I'm doing it that often, I would change the filter. I wouldn't do it every time. I don't see the necessity. And just to give you a little background, I did spend 4 years building nothing but Allison automatics. That was my, comeuppance in the business. I learned how the hard way. Did got real dirty and real sweaty doing that for many years. So I pretty much understand how automatics work and the importance of the fluid that you use in these things. And now here's the biggest thing you got. One of the real concerns is, even if you go to add fluid to an automatic transmission, don't just assume that it's Dexron 3 or Dexron 6, because some of them ask for Dexron 4. Now, will it be hugely detrimental? Not over the short term. Over the long term, it can affect the plates in the transmission, because we actually have a fiber material, as I said, and it's bonded to a steel plate. So if you've got a steel plate, you've got a fiber material bonded to a steel plate, and you use the wrong fluid, guess what can happen? You can actually get that plate to come apart. It can't stand, it's incompatible. So it's important to use the right stuff. The main thing is check and see what's in there before you go to service it. And if you really want it to last quite a while, we've got them going over 150,000, but you can't really expect many automatics to go much more than about 150 before they come apart. They'll go. I'm not saying you won't get one to go more than that, but depending on how hard you go, you could go as little as 75,000. You might go as much as 150. You might go further if you baby it pretty good, but the early ones were all, as this gentleman said, with spool valves. They have valves that operate in the valve body. The early ones used everything mechanical. Today, everything is pretty much all electronic. They got electronic solenoids operating things, and they're a little more forgiving. Now we can actually program when we start to have some issues. So, at any rate, changing the fluid is a really good plan. The cars that we see, as they say, cha-ching. Well, when you see a guy come in there that doesn't basically doesn't drive the car, they usually have a bigger repair bill than the guys that drive the car daily. They typically do. And the ones that I know, I sit them down, try to get them calmed down before I tell them, because they've had this car. And the worst scenario is a guy buys a car and he's bought it from a guy that's only got 10,000 miles on it. It's a 20-year-old car, got 10,000 miles or less. And he says, I'm going to drive it every day. I'm thinking, oh boy, this guy is in for some a heck of a rude awakening, because everything in it, whether it be the fuel in the tank, all the oils, and you tell him, hey, you need to change every fluid in that car immediately. And then I would suggest doing it a year later, because if you do, maybe you'll knock some of that possibility away of having some catastrophic failure. So that is really important. I'm glad you brought that up, because that is one of the key things. A Corvette owner and, car sitting in the garage is, it happens. It's just part of life. And if you're going to do that and let it sit and basically get a couple thousand miles a year, every 3-4 years, you need to change every fluid in it. Really wouldn't hurt to do it every couple years, but, definitely no more. 4 years is pushing it, is absolutely pushing it. We also have manual transmissions, and a lot of people think that a manual transmission, boy, those things, they just don't need anything ever. That thing will change the oil when it blows up. That's when we can do it, or need to do it. Unfortunately, a lot of the early Muncies, they did not have drain plugs. You can either add a drain plug, or you can drain it with a suction pump. Not a very pretty job, but it would be a good idea. Has anybody here had the pleasure of taking apart any manual transmission? Okay. Transmission is a transmission. Jaguar. Anyway. You got to go, man. A manual transmission, if you drain the oil in it, it is full of metal. There's no filter. If you clash the gears, they take a heck of a beating. So,
The synchros, they wear.
well, yeah, synchro. So you got brass, bronze. And you know, they just chip up. So to change the oil in a manual trans is a great idea. Now here's something a lot of guys say, well, why do I need to do that? Because this thing is so loose, it can't hurt anything, can it? What's the difference? Well, here's the thing. Just like the differential, you have oil that's unfiltered flowing through that transmission. The transmission oil does flow around. It doesn't just lay in the bottom and every once in a while it gets a little bit. It actually flows through that transmission and the differential. So if you have oil that's full of metal, guess where it goes? It goes through the bearings. Every bearing in that transmission is subjected to all that metal that's suspended in the oil. So it's really more important than ever to change the oil in a manual than an automatic, because at least you got a filter in an automatic, nothing in that manual. Now, of course, we've got the 6-speed, the ZF, and they're very particular about what oil you use in those. You don't just go out and say, oh, I'm going to get any oil again, I'm going to get the oil. Because there's Castrol, there's a couple of different brands that are recommended by ZF, and if you want it to shift properly, you better use it. At one point, Dextron 3 was used in them, which is not the plan. And if you put 75/90 in a ZF transmission, you'll get an arm like mine, because you got to do some work to shift through the gears. Oh yeah, if you can shift it. So it is very important that you look at, again, you know, I can't stress this enough. That is what I'm really trying to make the point here. When you go to service it, make sure you use the right fluid. And here's what you do. There's a couple of different sites, Pennzoil, Valvoline, Mobile One. There's a number of different sites that have these products available that you can find and put your car info in and see if they're compatible. Like I said, don't just assume because you saw it on, you Googled it and saw it on a forum that they used it and it worked, because you could end up costing yourself a lot of money over something as simple as, a $10 quart of fluid.